Thank you, Rosalind, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I get a bit carried away with enthusiasm at these meetings, you know. I really can't wait to hear what I've got to say. I've always been very lucky in my life. First of all, I was born in bed with a lady. I was so shocked and surprised I didn't speak for 18 months. But actually, when I say I'm lucky, I always think I was extremely lucky in discovering what I believe is basically the truth about health, disease and healing. I started my career as a medical student at Manchester University, where I spent 3 years. And I think it probably took me about 5 years to recover from that, because unfortunately that's not really the place to learn about health. Now, everybody uses this term health. We all speak about health. But what do we really mean by it? Is this working? Can you hear all right? Is that right? Always like to wander around a little bit. It palliates the nervousness, you know. What do we really mean by health? Now, it's a pretty difficult thing to define. And the word health is used in so many different things. You even talk about the economy being healthy. You talk about relationships being healthy. We use the word health to mean many different things. But when it comes to the health of an individual, what do we mean by it? Well, the word health was derived from an Anglo-Saxon word, hale, meaning whole. And wholeness is a very important concept in relation to health. You know, health doesn't merely mean the absence of symptoms of disease. I mean, anybody who can pass a physical is not necessarily healthy. Health relates not only to the person's physical condition, but also to their mental and emotional condition. It relates to their total well-being. So health then involves a degree of structural integrity and functional efficiency, which approaches, shall we say, an ideal. That is an idealized form of health. And this is what we should all be concerned about. Now, in healthcare, we have to think in terms of principles to understand how we can develop a science of health. We believe that the system of hygiene, as enunciated in the world's literature, and of course historically, hygiene relates of course to the goddess of health, Hygeia, the Greek goddess of health. But the term hygiene is a logical system. It relates to an understanding of health based on certain fundamental principles. It is a science, if you like. Now, when we talk about being scientific, and we have a theory about something and we say it's a scientific theory, one of the major criteria of a scientific theory is refutability or testability. If you present a theory of something and you're claiming that it's a scientific theory, then it must be testable. It must be capable of being refuted. Now, a lot of theories, of course, around, like the theory of Freudian psychoanalysis, for instance. It's very interesting. It has enormous explanatory power. But it's not a scientific theory, because there is no way that you can design an experiment, having constructed your hypothesis according to the lines of psychoanalysis. There's no way that you can set up an experiment and test it. So although it may sound very plausible, and in fact it may have aspects of truth within the limits of truth, but at the same time it is not scientific. So in hygiene we believe that we have developed a logical system of health, an understanding of health, and a means whereby we can achieve health, which is scientific. Because the hygienic system can be tested, and in fact has been tested. In fact, there's enormous studies that have been done, particularly in the last 20 or 30 years. Scientific studies, epidemiological studies, studies that are reported in the world's scientific and medical literature, which validate the system of hygiene that we represent. Now, when we talk about healthcare, we have to understand that health, disease, and healing represent an integrated concept. When we talk about healing, for instance, we have a similar problem as we had with the word health. But from our point of view, from the hygienist point of view, healing is a biological process. It is not a science, it's not an art, there's no such person as a healer, there's no thing that heals. Healing is a biological process. It's something that the organism does for itself. All healing is self-healing. And from our point of view, generally speaking, if a person can get sick, they can get well. Now, there's obviously a point of no return. A person who has deteriorated beyond the constraints of the organism is not going to recover. We're aware of that. But in most instances, generally as a generalization, we can say if a person can get sick, they can get well. The mechanism of health and disease is a continuum. Most people look upon health and disease as though they are antagonistic opposites. They talk about health, they talk about disease. They talk about disease as though it is an entity, as though it has some actual existence as an entity, as a thing. For instance, people talk about catching disease. Now, has anybody ever seen disease out there that you can catch? Of course not. So disease, then, is a process, not an event, not a thing, not an entity, but a process. When you get sick and you say you have a disease, what we have is a mechanism of the body making adjustments and adaptations and producing symptoms. So the temperature goes a little bit higher, the bowels move a little bit quicker, some of the functions of the body are exaggerated, some are diminished, but functional changes occur. We identify these functional changes as symptoms, and if certain symptoms occur together, we label them with a specific name which we call a disease. But a disease is merely a label that we are attaching to signs and symptoms that the body manifests in modifying and changing its processes. So then we say that disease is a process. Health is a process. We are aware of health in people, in ourselves, and we're also aware that it is not static, that it does fluctuate. We know on some days we feel more healthy than we do on other days. So health is a fluctuating quality. And understanding that fluctuating quality enables us to perceive our limitations, to recognize our individual capacities. Now, when we say that healing is self-healing, that all healing is a biological process, we must relate this to certain characteristics of the living organism, which are, shall we say, the basic axioms of hygiene. the fundamental axiomatic concepts. We can say about the living organism that it is self-constructing, that the organism grows from a fertilized ovum through all the different stages to the mature adult, and that the power of that growth and development is within the organism. It's not supplied by anything outside. It is resident within the organism. So we say then that the living organism is self-constructing. We also argue that the living organism is self-defending, that it has an enormous capacity to defend itself when its life and integrity are threatened. For instance, a person may inadvertently, or deliberately for that matter, swallow a virulent poison. So what happens? They become feverish, they're nauseated, they vomit, they may produce diarrhea, and the body is defending itself against that poison. And the more efficient and the more total is its expulsion of that poison as a means of defense, the better it is for the organism. So we argue then that the living organism is self-defending. It's not defended by things outside itself. It is defended by its own processes, the processes of life. Furthermore, we would argue that the living organism is self-repairing. It has this capacity to regenerate, to repair itself. A simple explanation: you cut your finger, it will heal. It's a spontaneous thing. Healing would take place quite spontaneously. An example of self-healing. Now, we cut our finger, we don't need a healer. We don't need a healing agent. Healing is a prerogative of the organism. It's a spontaneous phenomenon that will take place normally and naturally, providing there aren't impediments. And that's the critical point. So we're maintaining then that our basic premises are that the living organism is self-constructing, self-defending, and self-repairing. Right. Now, obviously, how do we apply this from the point of view of developing or evolving health or recovery from sickness? Well, the living organism, in order to do these things, self-construction, self-defense, and self-repair, in order to accomplish these things, the organism has certain basic needs, certain fundamental needs: food, air, water, sunshine, protection, activity, rest, sleep. These are some of the basic needs. But need is very important, and we're all aware of the desirability of securing our needs. If we're tired, we should rest. If we're hungry, we should eat. If we've lost our appetite, we should abstain from eating. So it is a question then of trying to interpret the needs of the body. Now, basically, we all have the same fundamental needs. There are primary needs and there are secondary needs. When it comes to psychological and emotional needs, these may vary quite widely from person to person. But fundamental physical needs are pretty general. However, as we're all aware, each and every one of us is unique. Aren't we lucky? So that uniqueness means that we all have a capacity and limitations that are peculiar to ourselves. Just because one person can go out there and run a mile in 4 minutes doesn't mean to say that we can all do it. Just because one person has a certain capacity to consume a large amount of food doesn't mean to say we can all do that. We can see individual capacity quite dramatically in our society. Those people who eat very little and gain weight so very easily. I'm sure we all know people like that. And we also know people who are at the opposite end of the scale, who can consume enormous quantities of food and they remain like that. So that is related to capacity. Now these two concepts of need and capacity are extremely important. An individual must be provided with his or her needs in order to carry out the normal functions of life. But these needs must not only be supplied, they must be provided within the individual person's capacity to use them. I always argue that it is more important for people to know their limitations than their potentialities. One thing that is important, we should recognize that we should live within our limitations. If we overstep our limitations, we are going to become enervated. Now, over the last 30 or 40 years, I'm going to explain it. Over the last 30, 40 years, a great deal of work has been done on the subject of stress. Now, the hygienist doesn't generally use the word stress in quite the same way as is conventional, because once again, the word stress tends to become difficult to define. Dr. Hans Seeley, world-famous physiologist, was the architect of the physiology and biochemistry of stress. But many, many years before him was a hygienist by the name of Dr. Isaac Jennings, who evolved this concept of enervation. Now, enervation merely means debility, weakness, lack of energy, and being run down, which is extremely important in relation to the evolution of disease. Enervation is the key. Energy is something that we are consuming every moment of our lives. And it is important for all of us to realize that the energy of life is not inexhaustible. We are often aware when we become tired. We're often aware when we become run down. In fact, quite often, we can identify when we become sick how it occurred. We're often aware of the fact that we have become debilitated, weakened, run down. Now, very closely related to this concept is the concept of stress. Because what does stress do? It debilitates us. It runs us down. It exhausts us. And we suffer the effects of this. And how we suffer the effects of this is not easy to identify. But we do know certain basic things about it. How it affects the endocrine system. How it affects fat metabolism, protein metabolism, carbohydrate metabolism. how it affects the nervous system. We're aware of these things, but often the effects are fairly general. Now, when this happens, that we become debilitated, or as to use our term, enervated, the chemistry of the body becomes adversely affected. And we find that nutritional synthesis, the normal elimination of waste from the body, these things can become impaired. In fact, many, many years ago, in the 1950s, there was a major report in the US Public Health Journal on the effects of enervation and the accumulation of various toxins. What was used in the actual report was the accumulation of the byproducts of intermediate metabolism. That these are accumulating within the tissues of the body, thus impairing its function. And this represents the beginnings of change, the beginnings of departure from health. But to emphasize a point I made earlier about health and disease are not antagonistic opposites, but they can be represented on a continuum. And I'll show you a diagram of this which will help to explain it somewhat. What we call the health-disease continuum. Right at the top of the scale we have health. That's above a point of toleration which is marked on the diagram. So health fluctuates in that upper level. But there reaches a point at which health will become impaired. And this is the result of this state of enervation. And this state of enervation comes about as a result of the person during their periods of work and activity, stress and so on, expending more energy than they're capable of recuperating during their periods of rest and sleep. Now, we're all well aware of the importance of sleep. It's very important. That's why I don't worry if you go to sleep now. At least I know you'll get some benefit from the talk. In fact, I don't mind if you get up and walk out. At least you get some benefit doing that. But don't walk towards me, that makes me real nervous. So what we have to do in life is to ensure that we get enough rest and sleep, which in modern life is a pretty difficult thing to do. You know, people work around it. They fit it in where they can. They have a quick nap here and a little snooze there, and that's how they get their rest and sleep. So it's not surprising that we're all more or less enervated all the time. But energy is the key. Make sure, above all, that you get sufficient rest and sleep, because your periods of wakefulness will be much more awake if you do. You'll be more efficient. You'll have more energy. You will be, in fact, more healthy. Now, as energy deteriorates, we enervate ourselves. We drop down this scale. And as the energy depletes and we become enervated, and our physiology becomes somewhat perverted, there are biochemical changes, and we can become what we loosely refer to as toxemic. Now, toxemic really means that we have within the tissues certain byproducts of metabolism which should normally be eliminated as rapidly as they are produced. But because of energy limitations, and the body does have energy limitations, these will tend to accumulate. This produces in the body a crisis. Because what is referred to as homeostasis, which is the stability of the internal environment of the body, physiologically speaking, the stability of the internal environment of the body is referred to as homeostasis. And the body works constantly. And the organisms unite to cooperate, to establish and maintain homeostasis. Now, as a result of this enervation, homeostasis can be disturbed. The chemistry is not really at the ideal, so the body has to make it so. And at a certain point, we will develop a disease. And of course, it's usually, initially, an acute disease. It's in the infants and the young that we see acute disease, because they have the energy. You don't see acute disease so much in the elderly. And where you do see it, you see it sometimes without even much of an elevation of temperature. Whereas in the young, as you know, an infant, a young child, they develop a fever at the drop of a hat. The slightest exhausting experience, a late night, too much excitement, an unusually heavy meal, and the young child or infant will quite often produce a crisis. They'll get sick. So what happens then? We establish a point of toleration. That's normal for everybody. But of course it's an individual thing. The point of toleration varies from person to person. As this state of toxemia builds up, the body has to take some remedial action. So it produces an acute disease. And certainly associated with many acute diseases are microbes. And therefore, that's where this concept of communicable disease, of catching disease, came from. Because it's the common belief that diseases, acute diseases, are caused by microbes. And I'm not going to argue that the microbes are intimately involved in the cause of disease. What I am saying, of course, is that they need an ally. On their own, they are not causes of disease. They do need some help. But of course, in modern life, we have real problems with this. For instance, there's a major item in Time magazine here entitled "The Revenge of the Killer Microbes. Are we losing the war against infectious diseases?" Unfortunately, because of this concept of war and peace, which is unfortunate when it comes to health and disease, it's generally looked upon that the body is capable of looking after itself quite well when it's healthy. But when you get sick, we have to then introduce weapons. We have to fight the disease. So what we find is that we have this simplistic concept, like an equation, that the organism plus microbe equals disease. So we have a situation where a virulent microbe attacks the host, multiplies in the tissues, elaborates toxins, and causes disease, during which time the host or the organism mobilizes its defenses and attempts to contain, escape, or destroy the microbe. This is a simplistic view. And of course the physician is called in to prescribe a medicine, a drug, or some other medicament with which to try to kill the microbe. Now this sounds fine, but of course the situation is much more complicated than that. In fact, studies carried out in Scotland some years ago showed that the microbe is quite clearly a secondary factor. It's somewhat like flies around the garbage heap. You want to get rid of the flies, get rid of the garbage heap. Similarly in the living body, why is it that some people get sick and some people don't get sick? That even occurs in epidemics. There are often many people that go through an epidemic without ever getting sick. So certainly there are individual differences. And these individual differences relate to toxemia. Now, it's not my purpose to talk at length about epidemics tonight, but we can introduce a few concepts here. For instance, it's interesting to know why the death rate is always high early in the epidemic. Why? Because the most enervated and toxemic people are the ones who get sick first. The most people who are most run down, the most debilitated. And commonly, these, of course, are among the elderly. And, of course, it's always interesting to know that in an epidemic, if the belief is that we catch the disease, that the microbe goes from one person to another, then how did the first person in the epidemic get sick? There's obviously got to be a first case somewhere. So, what we see as epidemics are mass sickness, which are caused, if you like, by many different things. Climatic factors, environmental factors, local and mass prostrating stress factors, as well, of course, as microbes playing their part. But it is too simplistic to suggest that the microbe is the cause of disease. Now, to the hygienist, the concept of cause is very, very much more elaborate than the common concept. The common concept of a cause of disease is something like typhoid fever is caused by the typhoid microbe. Now, certainly we're not denying the existence of the typhoid microbe, nor are we denying its importance in relation to the evolution of the disease. What we are saying that it is too simplistic. First of all, that takes any control of disease out of the individual's hands. And one of the features of the hygienic system, as Rosalind mentioned earlier, healthcare is self-care. First of all, we have to accept responsibility for our own health. We cannot get rid of this responsibility. As I often say to people, you see, a lot of people don't want this responsibility, and they'll say to me, oh no, when I get sick, I go to the doctor. I said, that's fine. Get the advice, get the guidance, get the counsel, sure. Well, I want him to take the responsibility. Well, that's all very well, but it's very... We can't blame the doctor if we get sick. We can't really blame the doctor in most instances if we die. So we must be prepared to accept responsibility for our own health. We must be prepared not only to accept the responsibility, but to act responsibly in relation to accepting it. And of course, as has previously been mentioned, the cost of healthcare is escalating so enormously that we must take on some responsibility for looking after ourselves. We must recognize that probably in excess of 90% of disease is within our own control. 90% of the health problems are within our own control. Certainly there are things that are outside our control. And unfortunately, there are many things in our environment which are outside our own control. However, taking this responsibility is extremely important. Now, disease then is an evolution. We get enervated, run down, we pervert our metabolism, and the body, in an attempt to restore normality, will produce disease. And of course, if you understand the pathophysiologic mechanisms of disease, the enormous complexity of disease processes, how the body, for instance, just taking one symptom, fever. How does the body produce a fever? It goes to a great deal of trouble to do it. It accelerates its metabolism. That's the chemical processes of the body. Certain centers in the brain become inordinately active. It goes through a cycle of enormous adjustment of its circulatory system, reducing the peripheral activity of the blood vessels, thus reducing heat loss from the body, suspending the radiation of heat from the body, partially suspending it, so that more heat is generated within. And when you look at the pathophysiology of it, the steps involved, the alterations in the in the nervous system, commencing in the brain, in relation to certain messengers received, the importance of the endocrine system, or the glands of the body, in relation to the production of the fever, the changes in metabolism that occur, the increase in the activity of the liver, the kidneys, the cardiovascular system in relation to alterations, concentrating blood flow on the internal organs and suspending blood flow to the periphery of the body. Now the body goes through all of this process for a reason. It is instigated as a means of defense. So what do we do in this situation? Oh, we rush out to the medicine cupboard or somewhere and we get something to get this fever, get rid of this fever, to suppress it, to bring it down. We're so afraid of this thing, all of a sudden we think, oh, the body's all right looking after itself in health, but now it's sick, we've got to do something. The body is just as much in control under these circumstances as it is in perfect health. It's gone to a great deal of trouble to produce this fever, with a very good reason. But people think somehow or other, oh, we mustn't let the fever get too high. You know, the person might eventually burst into flames. Well, of course, this cannot happen, as we know. There's a limitation on how high the fever can go, because very important processes in the body, in fact all processes within the body virtually, are regulated by substances called enzymes. Enzymes are proteins. They're very sensitive to temperature changes. So as the temperature rises, enzyme efficiency diminishes. The enzymes can no longer function very well at, say, 41, 42 degrees. So there's an automatic check on how high a fever can go. Unless, of course, you're foolish enough to supply external heat. You wouldn't want to be lying out in the sun, sunbaking, with a fever. Then it'll go very high. But under normal circumstances, there is a physiological limit as to how high the fever can go. But we produce this acute disease in response to changes in our physiology. And this process is a means that the body employs with which to restore normality. So we see health and disease as a continuum. Health or disease, they're not entities, they are processes. And all the processes are on the same continuum. So we produce an acute disease. One of the symptoms being fever. As I've mentioned, it's obviously not necessary to go through all of the symptoms, but maybe there's fever, maybe there's vomiting. And if you've ever been at the bedside of a person who's vomiting, and you look at what is expelled, you can appreciate that the body is far better off with it outside than inside. So once again, we see the remedial nature of the disease. And that generally goes for all of the things that the body expels in sickness. That you've got to accept the fact that the body is much better off with it on the outside. So here we have then an acute disease. And that is the first step usually when there's a departure from health. Now it may not be anything more than just a bit of a headache, which many of us experience. In fact, many people say to me, unless I get that coffee in the morning, I get it about 10 or 11 o'clock, I've got a headache. Of course you have. Withdrawal. Because you've been poisoned. You know, it's interesting how in our society we have these incredible double standards. And one of the questions that I asked myself 40 odd years ago at medical school was, why is it that when I am healthy and I take drugs, they will make me sick? But when I am sick and I take drugs, it's argued that they will make me well. Now that's a logical contradiction. Now, I'm not going to stand here and argue that there are no circumstances under which one might not use a drug. But I am convinced that the majority of people take far too many drugs, and that probably 90% of the drugs that are prescribed and consumed are more dangerous than helpful. Now what happens? We get this acute sickness. We've become enervated, run down, toxemic. The chemistry of the body is disturbed. The body attempts to put it right. It attempts to correct it. So therefore, it produces an acute disease. Now, our concept of an acute disease is, as I indicated earlier, a process. A defensive, remedial, eliminative, adaptive process. The body is doing these various things. It's eliminating, it's adapting, it is attempting to remedy an abnormal environment. The body is trying to defend its status quo. It is trying to defend this homeostasis that exists in the internal environment. But what we do generally is secure treatment. Now treatment, the problem with treatment is that it usually has nothing to do with the cause of the problem. And one of the worst things about a treatment for disease is the fact that it lulls us into this false sense of security. Oh, we have a treatment for this disease. But unfortunately, it doesn't relate to removing the cause. So what value is it? So we get sick. We rush and we have treatment. And the treatment, of course, is usually exhausting. Either it's some form of poisoning, and I know the refined term is medication, but I always remember in my first class in pharmacology, the professor wrote in big letters on the board, "Drugs are poisons." And of course, we all recognize that they are. The government recognizes they are. That's why they can only be prescribed by certain licensed people. That's why they can only be dispensed by certain licensed dispensers. Because they are poisons. So let's not be euphemistic about this. Let us accept them for what they are. So we get acutely sick, so we rush out and we take some medicine, some poison. And we suppress the body's remedial efforts. It may take some time to do this. But if you look at medical histories of people, they start off in infancy with a cold, and this becomes a pneumonia or a bronchitis, and gradually evolves to a chronic sinusitis or whatever. But gradually there is a progression. That is because they get beyond the acute disease stage and move into the chronic disease stage as the level of toleration increases or it descends the scale. And of course, with chronic disease, we have degenerative changes. But it's important to make distinctions between various types of actions of the body. And we should also make distinctions between the actions of the body and the actions of inert materials and agents and influences. Now, it is our contention that it is the body that acts. The body is the primary actor. So many people talk about the body as though it reacts. Now, let me show you what I mean here. If you take a laxative, you will get some action, so if it is of sufficient quantity. Now, what is that action? Oh, people say, yes, I took a laxative, it moved my bowels. Wrong. Your bowels move the laxative. After all, you give a laxative to a dead person, and I can assure you, nothing happens. The power of action is in the living organism. Very important to understand that. We must understand that the power of action is in the living thing, not outside it. This was illustrated to me many, many, many years ago when my grandfather told me the story of a man in Yorkshire in England who took over this old property, really dilapidated and run down, especially the garden, which was an absolute wilderness. But this man worked in this garden for months, morning, noon and night, until it was the finest garden in the whole district. And people used to come from miles around to see this garden. One day the local priest came along, and he saw the man working in his garden, and he said to him, "It's a wonderful garden you have here, absolutely beautiful." The man said, "Yes," he said, "and I've done it all by myself." "No," said the priest, "with the help of the Lord." "All right," the man said, "but you should have seen it when he was doing it by himself." Right, now the important point in that story is pretty obvious. The priest had in mind that the power of action was in the living thing. The man had in his mind that the environmental changes and needs that he provided were the importance. So what we have to do is put these two things together. We have to see that the living organism has the power of action, not things outside. Certainly we have different types of action. We can have electrical action, chemical action, mechanical action. But when we're talking about physiological action, it can, remedial action, defensive action that we're talking about in health and disease, it can only occur in the living organism. So this action is always important. Now, this action that the body produces is, of course, as I said, self-motivated, self-initiated. It's resident within the organism, this capacity to act. The body is working throughout our lives to maintain our health. Why doesn't it do so? The reason it doesn't do so is because of the overwhelming nature of the causes of disease. Now, as I said earlier, cause to many people means a microbe or something very simplistic. To the hygienist it means a whole range of things related to the environment. And as a result of these causes, and the fact that these causes are rarely, if ever, removed or attended to, we gradually descend this scale until we go through acute disease, chronic disease, degenerative disease, and eventually, as a result, we die. We are killed in most cases by the causes of disease. Now, looking at the principles of hygiene, one of the first principles we have to understand is that the environment which provides our needs, food, air, water, sunshine, etc., from those needs, we must relate those needs to the living organism. There should always be a normal relationship between the living body and the agents, materials, and influences that are provided for its life and survival. Now, we know that food has a normal relationship to the organism. But of course, these days, we're pretty hard put to define what we mean by food. We'll talk about that a bit later. But food has a normal relationship to the body. Why do we say it has a normal relationship? Because the body can digest it, absorb it, assimilate it, utilize it. It can incorporate it into its own tissues. It is usable material. Drugs are not usable material. We can't sit down and eat a meal of belladonna and digest, absorb, circulate, distribute, and utilize it. We can't even do that with caffeine that we take every morning with coffee. It's not usable. It becomes an impediment. It expends energy unnecessarily, adds extra beats to the heart, increases blood pressure. In other words, it's expensive of our energy, so it represents, in a remote sense, a cause of disease. As does anything else that fails to fit into this category of having a normal relationship to the body. Things must have a normal relationship to the body. Sleep, activity, this is normal for us. Narcosis is not normal. Physical abuse is not normal. This last week there was a report released extolling the virtues of alcohol. You know, a little drop of alcohol does you good. Now, when you look into the nature of the studies, they are not really scientific studies. They are merely surveys. And they find when they do a survey that people having a couple of beers here and there happen to live longer and have less stress than people who don't. But of course that's the only thing they've looked at. They haven't considered whether the person does more exercise, what their diet is like, or what their total lifestyle is like. I mean, quite often there's a lot of positive benefit derived from people getting together and having a couple of drinks, aside from the drinks. Now, alcohol is a protoplasmic poison. That means that it is poisonous to all forms of life. Now, the fact that we can add other chemicals to it, add some sugar to it, and add some other flavorings and make it palatable, doesn't alter the fact that if you were to drink pure alcohol, ethanol, you would find it quite objectionable. It has to be treated in a certain way to make it palatable. But if you taste alcohol, you would say that all of your natural sensibilities would tell you unmistakably, I shouldn't be taking this stuff. So therefore, we would argue that there is no normal relationship between the living organism and alcohol. But of course there is the argument, as the student said once, he said, well look, the professor was giving a demonstration. He had two glasses in front of him, one with water, one with alcohol. Into the glass of water, he dropped a worm. It continued to wriggle and survive. Into the glass of alcohol, he dropped another worm. It gave a few spasms and died. He said there to the students, that proves that alcohol is a poison. So one bright student stood up and said, yes, sir, but I need alcohol. I've got worms. So the importance of this principle of the normal relationship between the living body and the materials provided by the environment is very important. Now, unfortunately, in our present environment, we have to withstand the impact of many toxins and dangerous materials which have a no normal relationship to the living body. And often these things are outside our own personal control. For instance, recent reports indicate, for instance, that males are producing 50% of the sperm, what they were doing 30 to 50 years ago. In the female, many of the ova that are produced are not viable. That many of the factors involved in reproduction are being directly perverted by environmental toxins that have estrogenic effects. This is especially so of various pesticides that get into our foods. Now, recently in the United States, the Environmental Protection Agency showed that some of the foods had over 400 times the pesticide contamination above the limit that is allowed, 400 times the limit. When you're consuming food like this, of course, you've got to be pretty strong and healthy to withstand its effects. So therefore, the first principle in hygiene is to attempt to secure for the body materials, influence and agents and so on that have a normal relationship to it, that have a positive normal relationship to it. The second point is that we should try to avoid, so far as is possible, the causes of disease. And as I've said, we use the term cause in a wider sense. Now, if a person gets sick, I'm interested in all of the things that they might be doing that I do not consider in their best and most healthful effects. So that a person might say, well, what's the heck has coffee got to do with my arthritis? I can't show that there's a direct relationship between coffee and the evolution of arthritis. But what I do know is that coffee is not an agent which will be used by the body in order to elevate its health. It represents, in a remote sense, a cause of disease. And if we're investigating the evolution of disease in a person, we've got to be looking at all of the various causes. All of the factors that we can control must be examined. And as we know, most of the causes of disease are within our own control. Now let me show you another diagram here which will highlight a particular point about health and disease. Here we have a very important triangle. At the top we have heredity or genetics. Now, when we're talking about heredity and genetics, we are talking about factors over which we have no control. We cannot, as far as we know, positively alter our genes. We can certainly negatively do so, but not positively. We are given a set of genes at birth and we're stuck with them. We hear a lot today about oncogenes, genes which cause cancer. Cardiovascular genes, genes that cause heart attacks. And so it goes on. Now, hygienists for many, many years have argued, of course, that we all have certain strengths and certain weaknesses. We're aware of that, of course. We refer to these things as diatheses. That is, a person may have a particular diathesis, where they have a proclivity towards the development of, say, something like arthritis, or ulcers, or cardiovascular disease, or even cancer. There may be that tendency there. We get that from the genes. But the genes do not cause the disease. And recent work, and for those of you who are interested, there's a particular book just recently published, somewhat academic, which has quite clearly solved this problem of heredity and environment, etc., which has been an argument in biology for decades. The book is by Dr. Winifred Gallagher, entitled ID, Identity. However, what we do have a great deal of control over are the other two factors. As a human race, we can control, to a very large extent, our environment. As an individual, we can be selective about our environment. We can certainly control our own use of ourselves. Now, many of you would have heard of the work of F. Matthias Alexander and the Alexander principle. A very, very important principle. It is usually exploited only in a mechanical sense, which is a pity, because in actual fact, the principle that Alexander enunciated related to a total psychophysical re-education. And that's what we want to achieve in hygiene, is a psychophysical re-education. How the person uses themselves extends way beyond their physical use, but also their mental use, their emotional use, and their total use in relation to their environment. So in looking at that, we have a great deal of control over environment and virtually total control over use. So that gives us, in that triangle, the edge. So although we may have certain weaknesses that we may have inherited, we do have the capacity to reduce the effect of these weaknesses. I mean, I have an experience in my practice of a particular family where we have these oncogenes, or cancer-causing genes, where a mother dies of breast cancer. The eldest daughter dies of breast cancer. The youngest daughter dies of breast cancer. But one other daughter in the middle does not die of breast cancer. And I believe the answer lies in the intelligent lifestyle of this particular daughter. The others were just conventional. This particular daughter has taken serious responsibility for her health since a teenager. She is alive and well. The environment and use has made the difference, despite the probability of oncogenes. All disease has a cause. Health is a spontaneous process of the organism. It is quite spontaneous. We don't have to produce health. That's its normal state. Disease, we have to deliberately or inadvertently cause. Disease has to be caused. Now, when I use the term disease, I'm using the term disease not to refer to genetic defects or inborn errors of metabolism or various things like that. I'm talking about the type of sickness that evolves in our lives. Now, when we look at disease, we can make certain observations about it. There is, in disease, the cause, or causes, as we would prefer to argue. Disease is multi-causal. The causes are, as I've said, largely within our own control. Having engaged or been subjected to the causes of disease, the organism will act, and it acts in defense or in adaptation. If it can overcome the causes, the defensive process will be successful. If it cannot overcome the causes, and the causes persist, then the disease will persist and deteriorate. It is progressive. The pathology evolves. It's progressive. Now, as the causes persist, the changes may become degenerative. So we refer to the disease as being a degenerative disease. Now let me give you a very simple example of the cause, the process, and the effect, so you can make a more clear distinction between these various features that in medical texts and journals are all lumped together under the term disease. If you look for a definition of disease, it becomes extreme. I place my hand on some sort of surface, and I deliberately or inadvertently strike my hand with a hammer. And I break the bones, I mangle the tissues, it's bruised and bleeding, and eventually, as a result of the self-healing properties of the organism, it heals. But as it heals, there is gross deformity. The hand is no longer usable, as my hand is now. Now, what do we have in that scenario? We have the cause, which is the hammer, quite distinct from the rest of it. And that's what we want to understand in disease, that the cause is external, extrinsic. Even if it's intrinsic, as in bacterial endotoxins, it is externally related. So we have the cause, and then we have the process of healing or defense or whatever. So the bruising, the inflammation, the knitting of the broken bones, the repair of the tissue, all of that is the process of healing. That we would define as the disease. And then we are left with the deformity. Now the disease, which was the process of healing, didn't cause that deformity. The cause of that deformity was the hammer. Now, unfortunately, when we look at disease, shall we say, we look at cardiovascular disease, a very common example. The person evolves cardiovascular disease. The arteries are gradually accumulating morbid material in their walls, substances like atheroma. And eventually, the atheroma gets so bad that one of the coronary arteries is obstructed, and the person has what we commonly refer to as a heart attack. Now, we can see the progression there. But what was the cause of the heart attack? The cause of the heart attack was related to the cause of the atheroma. It was merely a progression. As the cause of the abnormal deposition in the arteries, that was the same cause that produced the ultimate heart attack. Now in arthritis, take another example. In arthritis, we see inflammation of the joints. Now inflammation is a normal biological process, part of the body's defensive mechanism in relation to injury or irritation within the tissues. The most common pathological process is probably inflammation. You recognize it in disease by the suffix itis: tonsillitis, appendicitis, gastritis, colitis, cholecystitis, cystitis, or whatever. And all that is happening is there we have a basic process of inflammation. The rest merely refers to the part where the inflammation is occurring. If it is nephritis, it relates to the kidneys. If it is hepatitis, it relates to the liver. If it's tonsillitis, it relates to the tonsils. But the inflammation is a similar pathological process. Now, in our example of arthritis, we see arthritis as this process of inflammation, as partial defense. Now, eventually, the person's joints become deformed. Now, what has brought that about? Many would argue it's the inflammation. But no, going back to our previous example of the hammer, it is the causes of inflammation that have not been removed. It is the persistence of the causes that have brought about this state of affairs. But what we have in our common terminology, in our common concepts, is disease being the cause of disease itself. Now that can't be. The arthritis doesn't cause the arthritis. The causes of the arthritis are antecedent, and those relate to many factors in our environment, many factors in our lifestyle that have to be examined and understood. But it's very important that we try to figure out the causes of disease. And if we're trying to recover from disease, we should spend our energies identifying and examining the causes. Now, we're talking a lot about causes, so what are these causes? Well, there are many causes of exhaustion or enervation. But we can look at many factors. We can look at a whole area of nutrition. Many causes relate to nutrition. Many causes relate to just poison habits that people have. Smoking, alcohol, coffee, tea, chocolate, foodless foods, and so on. Lack of physical activity, insufficient rest and sleep. And we can identify many different causes in our lifestyle. And we can probably identify well over 30 different areas of enervation. So what the hygienist is doing is looking at all of these features, all of these aspects of life, and attempting to identify particular factors which are going to bring about this state of enervation and toxemia, which is going to lead ultimately to acute disease, chronic disease, and subsequently degenerative disease. But unfortunately, the causes of disease are usually totally ignored. Treatments evolved, and you look at the treatments for disease, and oftentimes they have nothing whatsoever to do with the causes. So the hygienist is very radical in this department. There's always a radical investigation to try and determine what the causes are. And we use techniques and procedures which are designed to try to reduce the impact of causes or totally eliminate causes altogether. Now, in hygiene, we have, first of all, a total philosophy of health, trying to understand the nature and cause of health, disease, and healing, and recognizing the importance of individual responsibility. And when people take this responsibility and attempt to get the understanding that we're talking about, they will then have confidence. They'll have the confidence that they have a certain amount of control. And I think the greatest thing is to feel that you are in control. That you can understand that disease is not something that's haphazard. It's not a question of luck. That it is, to a very large extent, under our own personal control, that we can do something about it. And do something about it we should. Thank you.
We're going to have a short break now, and then afterwards will be opportunity for questions. Out in the foyer will be several boxes of leaflets. Some are of
And when you realize how little ascorbic acid or vitamin C we actually need, it's quite astounding. I mean, 200 years ago, British sailors were called limeys. And the reason they were called limeys is because they were given every day a small quantity of lime juice that prevented scurvy. Therefore, the sailors in the British Navy never developed scurvy because they took this lime juice every day. Now, there's a negligible amount of vitamin C in lime juice, particularly as it's preserved over months. The amount of vitamin C is so little that it's amazing that they were able to maintain the health that they were. Now, nobody is going to tell me that if they can prevent scurvy with such a small amount of vitamin C, that we need somewhere in the region of mega doses to achieve high-level health. That's absolute nonsense. Certainly we need a lot more than we need to prevent scurvy, there's no question about that. But a major study was completed in 1995 by the CSIRO. And this was done over many years, studying people in relation to the protective effects of megadoses of vitamins and so on. And what they found was, in the published report, there was just a slight benefit of taking these megadoses of vitamins, which are indeed very costly. But what they did say in the report also was that if a person were to eat plenty of fresh fruits and vegetables every day, they would do just as well. So they were assuming that the people who were taking these megadoses were on a fairly conventional diet, and that if they added fruits and vegetables to that diet, they would certainly not need the vitamins. Now, one also has to understand another side of it, that these vitamins, when taken out of their natural context, not only have a nutritional effect, but they also have a pharmacological effect. So there are pharmacological consequences of taking these things. Except large doses of vitamin C, for instance, may be responsible for renal stones, kidney stones, may be responsible for hypertension. So there are consequences for taking such massive doses. But it should be fairly rational to understand that when you take a nutrient out of its natural context in food, concentrate it, put it in pill form, and then take it in massive doses, it really has no relationship to the natural food. And in most cases, all that you're going to do is produce very expensive urine, because that's the way it's going to come out. So really, I would say to people, look, save your money, eat plenty of fresh, wholesome food, but certainly forget about the vitamins. The vitamins you need are in the food that you eat. Yes. Mm-hmm. Well, I don't really think that Chinese herbal treatment is anything different from herbal treatment. I think they're just using different herbs, that's all. And we have to understand that medicine was a herbal practice until virtually the 20th century. It's only in the last century or so that the pharmaceutical industry has really developed. Most of the drugs that were employed formerly were herbal drugs. Some of the most powerful poisons known to man, strychnine, belladonna, are herbal in origin. So, to me, herbalism is just the practice of medicine. I make no distinction. If you're poisoning yourself with pharmaceutical products or you're poisoning yourself with herbs, you're still poisoning yourself. Either a substance is a food or it is not a food. If it's not a food, from my point of view, it has no business in the body in the first place. So I don't have much time for any form of herbalism. Now, if I can just continue on that, it's a funny thing about human beings, but they seem to be hell-bent on poisoning themselves. You know, it's a funny, I always remember the story of the man in New South Wales. He was spraying his fruit flies, the fruit, because of fruit flies. And unfortunately, he inadvertently swallowed one of the flies. You know, So he goes, gives himself a bit of a spray. And you know what he said afterwards? He said, that fly almost killed me. But people never get tired of poisoning themselves. Why must we do this? When you get sick, as I explained earlier, the body goes to such extreme physiological lengths to develop these symptoms, to perform this function so delicately that you have to then go in with a sledgehammer and somehow or other treat it, suppress it, subdue it, fight it, or to use a more refined term, cure it. If you're going to use the term cure, the process itself is the process of cure. The body is doing this with great alacrity and finesse. Why interfere with it? Why not cooperate with it? Provide it with its needs. Remove the causes. Allow it to go to a natural conclusion, recovery. Okay.
There are so many contradictions today about what you should eat and what you should not eat.
You're telling me.
Meat, poultry, God knows what else. That it's very hard to know what to cut out of your diet and what to add. What is your idea of an ideal breakfast, lunch and dinner?
Oh, goodness me. Why don't you just stop eating altogether?
How do you recommend that?
For most people, they could do it for quite a long time. You know, there was an item in the Postgraduate Medical Journal a few years ago of a man who fasted, total abstinence from all food except water, for 382 days. And people worry about doing it for a week or two, you know. Right, well, certainly, it's when you read the popular magazines, even books on nutrition, and all sorts of persuasive arguments are employed why you should eat this food, that food, or the other food. And it does become very confusing. It's almost enough to make you give up reading. However, one good way to do it is to try to refer the argument back to nature. And what you find quite often with these products that are widely recommended and advertised is that they are motivated by the profit margin. The profit motive underlies a lot of recommendations that we can encounter in magazines and newspapers and so on. If the person has a product to market, you should immediately be suspicious. There is a whole range of products that are claimed to be grown in certain areas of the world where the soil is richer. There are certain products that are advertised that are grown under certain special conditions that are said to be superior. Now, it's got to be admitted that the food is very much dependent on the soil upon which it's grown. And if the food is provided as nature produces it, then I generally have no problem with it. But if it's been subjected to a great deal of processing, then I think that we've got to be extremely suspicious. That doesn't mean to say that we would necessarily condemn all processed food. After all, I mean, if you cook any food, you're processing it. Even steaming vegetables, you're processing them. But processing should be looked upon with a certain degree of suspicion. Now, if we're talking about an ideal diet, we have to ask the question, for whom? Because an ideal diet for you may not be the ideal diet for you. Once again, we're looking upon differences in the individual. And this is very important. I mean, I find that some people will thrive on a 100% raw food diet. Just fruit and salad. And they really thrive on it. They maintain weight, they maintain energy, they're in good health. But I also find other people who will waste away on such a diet. They'll lose weight, They'll lose energy. They get loose, foul-smelling stools. They just cannot handle it. So once again, diet has got to be tailored to the individual's requirements. But what we're basically looking at is a generally whole food diet, avoiding generally refined and processed foods. We're looking at plenty of fresh fruits and plenty of fresh vegetables. We're looking at also maybe using some cooked vegetables, but they certainly should not dominate the diet. I think as much raw food as is practicable is desirable, but then again, it has to be organized to the individual's needs. There is no such thing as a blueprint for health that will suit everybody. No such thing at all. We can only talk in terms of principles, because I can assure you that what one person will thrive on, another person will die on. That's quite possible. And it's because of these individual differences that we talk about. But that doesn't mean to say that because you might say recommend fruit and salad for one person, that you're going to recommend fillet steak for another. I mean, I think generally speaking that Homo sapiens is essentially a vegan. I believe the natural food of the human being does not include animal foods. But I also realize that people can live and maintain good health, including some animal foods. But they should be certainly extremely restricted if you're going to include them at all. But I think that when you read claims like human beings need to eat chicken or they need a good steak at least once a week, you've got very extravagant claims. There are thousands of people out there who live their whole lives in vigor and in health, not eating any animal foods at all. And I think that is the normal for the human being. I think when we consider comparative anatomy, physiology and biochemistry, the human being falls into a category of a fruit and vegetable feeder. But certainly the human being is not a herbivore. There's got to be another category, and we find that other category in the higher anthropoids. But normal diet, we can only generalize about it, because if I say a person should eat such and such for breakfast, such and such for lunch, such and such for dinner, it's not going to suit everybody. Does it answer your question?
Thank you, yes.
Good, okay. Yeah, this gentleman had a question. Oh.
I'm just wondering what your experience or views on the value of medications made available for the treatment of mental illness, specifically schizophrenia, and what you think would be a valuable natural treatment for such.
Mm-hmm. The question relates to what my view is about medications in relation to mental illness, schizophrenia, etc., and what would be an alternative approach to these things. Well, obviously, we have enormous difficulties here, and if we look around us, do we see that mental illness is diminishing or on the increase? Do we see that dealing with mental illness with medications is actually solving the problem of mental illness? I rather doubt that it is, but I think that there are people who are, shall we say, functioning in society who would otherwise not be able to function in society as a result of the medication they're taking. We must also realize, of course, that whilst the medication may be dealing with the symptoms, it is also producing rather nasty side effects. And the word side effect is really the wrong word, because it is really an effect. When you take a drug, it has effects. Now, it's all very well to say that the effects that you don't like, we'll call those side effects. They're just part of the effects. Now, there have been a number of articles appearing in medical journals about the employment of fasting and hygienic care in mental illness. A psychiatrist in New York, whom I personally know, Dr. Alan Scott, has written extensively on fasting and schizophrenia, and he's also had a lot of experience with it. Now, unfortunately, we're limited in how we can apply it in our own practice because, generally speaking, we're not dealing with mental patients because of the obvious problems of restraining them and enforcing the care and so on. We can't do that. But I do believe that with the judicious employment of fasting and hygienic care, that most of these people will be a lot better off and will either recover or be a lot better than they are. But I have a lot of reservations about much of the medication that's employed. Yes?
Dr. Burton, I know you didn't elaborate much on food, just quite a mouthful. My wife is insulin dependent diabetic and
I beg your pardon, your life is what?
my wife is
Insulin diabetic, yeah.
and how can she benefit from the activity?
Are we talking about juvenile diabetes here or type 2? I see, okay. Well, there's a lot of evidence in support of the successful care of people with type 2 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes is a different matter. These people are, of course, utterly dependent upon insulin. However, this does not alter the fact that these people would benefit greatly, even taking insulin, by following and pursuing a hygienic lifestyle. The functions of the hygienic lifestyle would certainly provide better materials and influences than the conventional lifestyle. So we haven't solved the problem of diabetes by providing insulin. Since the advent of insulin in 1922, the incidence of diabetes has risen over 2,000%, which is a frightening and alarming factor. And diabetes in our society affects somewhere in the region of 2 or 3 people in every 100. So it's quite a frightening thing. But age-onset diabetes is relatively easy to deal with. Juvenile diabetes is a different matter. Now, one thing I would warn against, that people with diabetes should not fast. They should not undertake fasting under any circumstances. See, with fasting, your normal currency of energy in everyday life is the blood sugar level, glucose. When you fast, your blood sugar level falls, and other mechanisms come into play. One important one is gluconeogenesis. That's deriving glucose from a new source. That's where the body derives glucose from protein in the muscles and so on. Next is a process of ketosis, where the body produces ketones from fat, which the diabetic produces quite liberally. The only thing is that when the blood sugar level falls, the body can utilize the ketones as a source of energy. In the diabetic, the blood sugar level doesn't fall. So these adaptations to fasting do not occur. So the person can then go into a diabetic coma with high ketones. That will not happen to the normal person because they will use the ketones as energy. The diabetic cannot do so. So one of the most dangerous things to do is to fast a person with diabetes. So I want to make that quite clear. Do not consider fasting in the case of diabetes. Yes?
For something like high blood pressure. I have high blood pressure and I've been investigating.
Clinic. And I've yet to see a person yet who hasn't responded favorably. I mean, with some you get much better results than you do with others. But hypertension usually responds favorably. But one of the unfortunate aspects of hygiene is that it must be, as I say to people, you not only have to believe in it, you have to do it. And with something like hypertension, you have to be pretty ruthless about your lifestyle and the avoidance of the causes. But certainly hypertension is a relatively easy symptom to deal with. Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about the process of changing lifestyle and developing what I understand the healing process and going through the changes and such like?
Well, are we here for another talk?
Yeah.
Is that right? Obviously, for a person to recover health, one thing is indispensable: change. And the only person that you can satisfactorily change is yourself. I know we all rush around trying to change other people, and we're always complaining about other people that they ought to change this and change that and change themselves. But the only person we should really be changing is ourselves. That's the person we can really change. The one thing that hygiene demands of people is that we change. Now, some years ago, there was a publication in the United States of 300 people with cancer who had recovered, either in spite of treatment or without treatment. Anyway, they had recovered. They were listed as spontaneous remissions. They'd had the audacity to recover without official sanction. And they investigated these 300 people to find out why. Why did they recover? What they found with all of them was this: that they had all changed. Some had changed their job. Some had changed their home, gone to live in a different climate. Some had changed their lifestyle. Some had undertaken meditation. But every one of them had done something quite dramatic in their life that brought about a change. And that's one thing in the recovery of health that we demand of people. They must change. Even if it just means quitting smoking, or just changing diet a little bit, getting more physical activity, getting to bed a little bit earlier. Whatever. A person must be prepared to change. So what we're saying here is change. How much? Well, I always say there are people who are 10%ers, there are 20%ers, there are 90%ers. Nobody's 100%. But it depends, first of all, on how motivated they are. Now, there's nothing like a very serious health problem to motivate people. I always believe that with a system like hygiene, to understand it and appreciate it, you either have to be desperately ill or remarkably intelligent. Most of us have got to an understanding of it because we were sick. And I include that myself in that category. I was too stupid to see it at the beginning, but when I was sick enough, and sometimes I'll get a patient who will come to me, you know, and when I say to them what they've got to do, they'll say, I'm not sick enough for that yet. But eventually they get back to my office. I remember one young gentleman in particular, rheumatoid arthritis. Just the beginnings of it, a few pains and aches in jaw. Oh, I'm not ready to do that yet. Change my diet, give up my hamburgers at lunchtime, give up my beers with the boys at night. No way. 4 years later, he came into my office almost like this with his arthritis. He'd suffered enough then, he was prepared to change. So change is the key word. Be prepared to change. In this world, as they say, there's no such thing as a free lunch. And it goes for health. If you want to be healthy, you want to recover your health, if you're sick, you've got to be prepared to do something about it. Take the responsibility and change. So how do you change? Well, that's easy. You just make a decision to change. Then you carry it out. And you might succeed for a day or two. You might succeed for a week or two, but you'll probably fall by the wayside. You'll backslide and you'll do silly things, but you pick yourself up again and you try again. But very, very rarely, unless the person is really desperate, will they pursue a good lifestyle right from go and stay with it. But if it's too traumatic for you, you do it by degrees. You use the shoehorn method by gradually easing yourself into it. So, you know, I remember very, very clearly one of my teachers, a brilliant guy, and he came to England, settled in London in 1911. He was a graduate of Lindglass College in Battle Creek Sanatorium in the United States. And he was fired with this enthusiasm for this change in lifestyle. He opens his office in the West End of London and puts his shingle out and gives a few talks, and patients come in, tells them what they've got to do, because he never sees them again. You know, the shock was too great. So after a while he thought, look, I've got to pay my rent. I've got to pay for the office, the electricity, my secretary. I've got to earn a living somehow. So he'd sit the patient down and talk to them and educate them. And he'd go through their lifestyle and pick on maybe exercise, well, or maybe their diet or something. He'd say, well, what do you have for breakfast in the morning? And they'd say, oh, well, I have my milk and cereals and sugar and coffee and ham and eggs and this, that and the other. And he'd go through everything and he'd say, okay, well, for this next week, he said, I'd like you to cut out the ham at breakfast time. Just have the eggs on the toast and the cereal and the coffee. And he'd make a little change like that, and sure, the person would go away. They'd come back the next week, and the next week he'd do a little bit more. And then in 2 or 3 months' time, he'd have the patient coming back, and he'd be talking to them and educating them and bullying them and persuading them and counselling them and so on. And eventually, over a few months, he'd get them on a good lifestyle. And they'd keep coming back, and he was paying his rent, and so and things were working out. So often when we talk to people in this way, I might get a new patient, I try and make an assessment. You know, can this person, can they withstand the whole truth right now? Or shall we ease into it gradually, you see? And of course it's necessary to do this because this is called, in popular terms, psychology. We have to understand that we live our lives in here. The mind is supreme. And I say something to you, and if immediately you close your mind, I'm not going to get anywhere now. That's the finish. So I have to realize that I've got to break down all these barriers in here. And I've got to try to win you over with a persuasive argument that you should even make a change. So we start off with a little change. And with that little change, the person finds they're very successful. You know, they can go a week without their ham and eggs in the morning, just having the eggs. Or they make a slight change, a modification, and that gives them a bit of confidence. And we go along like that. And that's how you do it. You don't necessarily have to suddenly, you know, you have to turn over a new leaf. It's much better if you turn over a whole forest. But you can do it leaf by leaf, as it were. But change is necessary, and however you change, it's got to be permanent. Like a person says to me, well, how long should I continue to do this? I say, well, how long do you want to live? When you get tired of living, don't do it anymore. You know, the thing is that, you know, life is wonderful. People say, gee, I don't want to get old. 80 years would be long enough, you know. And they believe that right until they're 79. But the thing is, if you feel well and you're healthy, you've got a lot of energy and you're full of vigor, you really want to live forever. I mean, I wake up every day and I think, God, another day in paradise. How wonderful. All right, I live in a nice place. Trees and birds and so on. But anyway, another day in paradise. I'd like to live forever. So, you know, a lot of it's in here. What we create ourselves. We create our own happiness and our own misery to a very great extent. And this, the psychology in hygiene is very important. We've got to, I mean, to use a trite expression about thinking positive. We create our own life in our minds, and we create our own environment by using our minds. We're creating our own use by our minds. And we have to continually perhaps motivate ourselves. We shouldn't have to do this, but we do because of the environment in which we live. So many things are against us today. So many things are in opposition. And then, of course, there's always the person who's going to come along and say, are you sure you're doing the right thing? You know, are you sure you're getting sufficient B12? Are you sure you're getting enough folate? You sure you're not overdoing this exercise, going out for this run for 300 yards every morning? You know? And this is what you have to contend with. It makes it somewhat difficult. But change is necessary. The person who isn't prepared to change, they're waiting to die. That's what I believe. Yes?
I wonder how many more questions you want to...
Well, I have two more questions, right? Two more questions. Yes, this lady. Yes, I am familiar with William Hay. He's very successful. Quite a great guy, actually. I think it has a lot of merit, and I think it specifically has a lot of merit where people have gastrointestinal problems. With a lot of people, I don't know that it's really essential, but I think that people who have gastrointestinal problems, digestive problems, indigestion, dyspepsia, things like that, it has quite remarkable effects, and I would endorse it. And it certainly is not in any way unhealthful for anybody to do. I think it has a lot of merit. Yes.
I was one of your 10%ers, 20%ers, probably 50%ers over 25 years since I first knew you. 12 months ago, we made the decision to come up to your clinic, my wife and I. When we drove out to your gate, we pulled up about 100 yards down the road. I said to my wife, I never felt this thing in 25 years.
Oh, thanks very much for that. It's very nice. But of course, you've been more than a 50%er for that last 12 months. Very important. I'll just take the gentleman in the back here then. Of course.
Would that disease process continue down the generation?
Exactly. That was the point I was trying to make. Yes, exactly. I would argue that way, certainly. That with the continued suppression of disease, the body produces symptoms, we suppress it. You get a headache, you take a pill. You get a stomach ache, you take a dyspepsia. You get constipated, you take a laxative. Whatever. You are suppressing natural tendencies of the body. And by interfering with acute disease, with constantly suppressing symptoms, you are producing a descendancy on that scale. So you are actually converting an acute disease probably into a chronic disease and furthering the degenerative process. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, it's been a pleasure to meet you and speak to you this evening, and thank you for your attention. Good night.